Your adult self is a haunted child. Freud on childhood and trauma. Let me ask you a quiet but piercing question. What if your adult self isn't fully grown? What if it's not even fully conscious? What if, at the core of your being, a frightened child still whispers and still hurts? This was one of Freud's boldest and most enduring insights. That the child never really disappears. That childhood is not a chapter we leave behind, but a force we carry forward. That what you felt, feared, or were denied in your earliest years still shapes your love life, your anxieties, your beliefs, even the things you think are rational. In this episode, we'll explore Freud's understanding of childhood trauma and neurosis, his theory of repression, transference, and symptom formation, the landmark cases that built his legacy, the modern science that confirms and challenges his view, and the haunting question at the center of it all. Are we ever really grown up? For Freud, childhood wasn't just important, it was everything. He believed the personality is largely formed by age 5, that early experiences of love, loss, frustration, and fear lay the foundation of who we become. But not consciously. Children, Freud said, are intensely emotional and profoundly vulnerable. They experience desire, rage, jealousy, and attachment without the language or logic to make sense of it all. So what happens to those overwhelming feelings? They are repressed. The child pushes them down, buries them in the unconscious, because to feel them fully would be too painful, too dangerous. But the repressed doesn't die. It returns, distorted, disguised, delayed. It returns in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in anxiety, in addiction, in self-sabotage. Freud saw the adult not as a mature, rational being, but as a child wearing grown-up clothes. A haunted house where old ghosts whisper through the walls. Let's step into Freud's clinic. He wasn't studying brain chemistry. He was listening to patients whose symptoms had no medical cause. Paralysis, amnesia, panic, tics, obsessions, the diagnosis of the time. Hysteria, mostly affecting women, largely misunderstood. Freud and his mentor, Joseph Breuer, discovered something revolutionary. When patients spoke freely about memories, feelings, childhood experiences, the symptoms often diminished. This became the basis for Freud's talking cure and his belief that symptoms are expressions of repressed trauma. One of the most famous cases was Anna O. She had hallucinations, speech problems, and paralysis. But when she spoke of her father's illness and death, her symptoms began to resolve. Freud concluded that traumatic memories are split off from consciousness. These fragments return as neurotic symptoms. The symptom is not random. It is meaningful. It's the unconscious trying to speak when the conscious self refuses to listen. Freud coined the term repression to describe the mind's way of protecting itself from unbearable reality. A child abused, humiliated, or abandoned may forget the experience entirely, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Yet the trauma festers. It leaks into behavior. It morphs into fear, mistrust, compulsions. Freud saw repression as the cornerstone of neurosis, and he believed that healing required bringing the repressed into awareness, through dreams, slips, associations. But this theory has not gone unchallenged. In the 1980s and 90s, a wave of therapists began recovering repressed memories in adult clients. Many of these memories involved abuse. But critics argued that suggestive therapy could create false memories. Freud himself had warned about this danger. In fact, he had abandoned an early theory that all neurosis came from abuse, partly because he feared his patients were fantasizing, not remembering. So the truth lies somewhere in between. Modern neuroscience confirms that trauma can disrupt memory, causing both amnesia and hyper-remembering. The line between memory and meaning is blurred. But Freud's core idea remains. What we cannot face, we bury. And what we bury, buries us. Let's bring this down to real life. You might see the child in the adult, in the person who fears abandonment, but clings too tightly, in the perfectionist who cannot tolerate failure because mistakes once cost them love, in the person who avoids intimacy because closeness once meant pain. Freud believed adult dysfunction is childhood replayed, and often we don't just repeat behaviors, we recreate the emotional environment we knew best. This is why some survivors of childhood neglect seek emotionally distant partners. Why some victims of criticism become critics themselves. Why those abandoned in youth abandon others first, to avoid being hurt again. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to reenact past trauma, hoping somehow for a different ending. It is tragic, but also, paradoxically, a form of hope. The child inside still wants to be seen, heard, loved, and until we meet that child, we risk letting it drive. In therapy, Freud noticed something strange. Patients would begin relating to the analyst not as a stranger, but as a parent, a lover, an enemy. They would project old feelings, love, fear, anger, onto the therapist. This is transference. And the therapist, in turn, might feel unexplained emotions, called countertransference. Freud realized that the therapeutic space was a repetition of childhood, a stage on which the unconscious could reenact its old scripts. This insight changed therapy forever. It meant that healing wasn't just about interpretation. It was about relationship. The therapist becomes the mirror in which the patient sees the child they once were, and if things go well, the adult they might become. Modern relational psychoanalysis, attachment-based therapy, and even trauma-informed care all build on this Freudian idea. That healing is not a download of insight, but a corrective emotional experience. The child learns to trust again, to feel, speak, and be held, and the adult, at last, begins to integrate. So, what are we to make of Freud's view of childhood? He wasn't sentimental. He didn't idealize childhood. He saw it as the crucible of the self, the source of our deepest joy and pain. He taught us that. The child is not innocent, but intense. The adult is not rational, but layered. Trauma is not what happens, but what remains. You don't need to remember your childhood perfectly to feel its presence. It's there in the way you flinch when criticized, in the way you fear being seen, in the way you long for safety, or sabotage love when it gets too close. Freud's genius and his risk was to suggest that we are never only adults. We are ex-children, carrying wounds, masks, and hopes from long ago. But that doesn't mean we're doomed, because what was once unconscious can become conscious. What was once suffered in silence can now be spoken. And in that speaking, in that witnessing, the child is no longer alone. That, perhaps, is where real maturity begins. Curious minds never stop. Subscribe to keep exploring.